Okay, welcome back to another episode of Litigious, the world's number one podcast discussing legal issues in the news and lawsuits in the news. I am Scott Peterson. Giovanna is here with me as always. A reminder, this podcast is brought to you by Zerazio Peterson, a plaintiff's personal injury and employment law firm in New York, also in Massachusetts and Vermont. If you enjoy the podcast, please like, follow, subscribe, share with a friend, and we will get right into it. It's been hard to avoid, very hard to avoid, any discussion other than the conversations around the fallout from the Charlie Kirk assassination last week. And we talked about this briefly last week, but the there has been an explosion of firings, uh, retractions, additional firings, and all kinds of opinions being thrown out on social media and the news because of comments around Charlie Kirk's assassination and his political views. Um, and we thought it would be appropriate to kind of talk about some of the issues that are coming up, particularly with respect to employment, and we'll end the conversation with the biggest, most recent part of that. But when we think about the protections that employees have for speech, we talked last week a little bit about the right to say whatever you want in the context of working for a private company and the potential consequences of saying these things online. And as of last week, we had seen, I think, one or two individuals who were fired for comments they made relating to their opinions about Charlie Kirk following the assassination. But that has exploded in terms of the numbers of people impacted. So why don't we start with the category of private employees, and we'll talk. Why don't we talk about, how this is kind of played out, and also why there are, in fact, some exceptions to situations where a private employer can just fire someone because of the things that they say online.
Yeah, last week I think we focused mostly on the private employees and we kind of emphasized that, whether somebody agrees with it or not, typically private employees don't have any speech protection. Um, and if you say something on social media in particular that your employer doesn't like, typically they can fire you, and I just want to say the caveat to that is, or not even a caveat, it's a very different situation if you're going and complaining internally at work about something. That's not really a free speech situation in a private workplace, but there's certainly many different types of complaints that are protected when you make them, in the context of your work conditions or something like that. But this is just purely sort of private speech that you make on your own personal social media that your employer doesn't like. And typically, in this day and age, employers all have social media policies. And if you say something and they don't like it, they can fire you. And if there's a, backlash out there, in the world because there's a hot topic going on, that's a real risk that people take. So I don't want to necessarily belabor that too much because we talked about it last week, but I did think there were two sort of interesting cases in the news before we get to the huge one that is all over the news today, which is where you can sometimes start to have issues even in the private workplace. And one of them is apparently she was the last Black woman opinion columnist at the Washington Post, and she was fired for misconduct after she made a couple of posts about Charlie Kirk's death, one of which was his own words in quotation marks about some prominent Black women and whether they had sort of earned their prominence. That in a vacuum, you could say, okay, she's a private employee, and if they didn't like it, they can fire her, whether we think it's fair or we agree with it or not. I think what can become difficult in some of these situations is that employers really have to make sure that they are applying their social media policies and their definition of misconduct evenly, because if there are, a bunch of men or a bunch of white men or a bunch of white women who are also employed by this company who have made similar types of social media posts, maybe about a different hot topic that was in the news, or committed some other form of misconduct, because they're calling this misconduct. So it's like, okay, well, what does this employer consider misconduct to be? If you don't apply those standards evenly amongst your employees, and there's a good faith argument to be made that the reason why you did not apply it evenly is based on someone's protected status, then you're going to start to have claims of discrimination.
Yeah, exactly. And I would not be surprised if some employers had employees that maybe they had a history with, maybe they were sort of looking to push, and this could be the straw that broke the camel's back or the catalyst for the decision making. And then they use this as the catalyst for the decision making, and all of a sudden the employee says, "Well, wait a minute, you didn't apply this equally across the board to other non-protected classes." So yeah, you could see how that could be a problem.
Yeah, and then the other another news story that I saw that I thought was interesting was this was in New Jersey, and a nurse reported a doctor for making, I think the announcement of Charlie Kirk's shooting had been made sort of in their place of employment in kind of real time. And the way I sort of read of how this went down is that the doctor sort of in the moment, made an insensitive comment about his shooting, and the nurse reported that to HR. Now, I think there were some, you know, potentially inaccurate reporting about what then happened with the nurse. First, it was reported that she was fired and that she filed a lawsuit, or that she was suspended. And the reason for that being was that she took it a step further and didn't only report it to HR, but she also called him out on her own social media. So it was a little bit of kind of like a brain teaser in this situation, because it was the person doing the reporting of the person who allegedly said something insensitive who was fired. And at that moment in time, we didn't really know what happened to the doctor. Ultimately, the way I understand that this shook out is that the doctor resigned and the nurse was reinstated. I thought this was just kind of also an interesting employment law situation, because typically, and we don't practice in New Jersey, but typically under federal employment discrimination laws, when you make a complaint to human resources, for that complaint to be protected from retaliation, it has to be a complaint of illegal conduct. So if you report sexual harassment is illegal under Title VII. So your complaint is protected from retaliation. But there is a ton of case law that Title VII and the employment discrimination laws in general are not a code of civility in the workplace. And every time you complain about a coworker doing something inappropriate or untoward, that's not always going to be a protected complaint. So I thought that was interesting, because I think the employer may have had an argument, if this had all shaken out a different way, that her complaint wasn't protected from retaliation. But ultimately, I don't think they fired her for making that complaint. It was reported that they fired her for the social media posts. That, I think, would have probably been appropriate as well. And we have said this also in the context of, counseling people who are still employed. If you have a good faith complaint against a coworker or your boss, go and make the complaint to HR and let them do what is typically a confidential internal investigation. When you then go outside of the workplace and start complaining about this on social media, if it's a personal grievance, you may not be protected. If you're complaining on behalf of the group, maybe you're protected by the NLRA and some things that we talked about last week. But I thought that was kind of an interesting case. I think it ultimately shook out that, like I said, the doctor resigned and the nurse was reinstated. So we're not going to get to see any nitty-gritty of these employment issues play out. But I do think it was an example also of something we talked about last week of, public shaming. Sometimes public shaming can come back around on you.
Yeah, we may not have seen it in this case, but I think particularly given some of the comments from, among others, the vice president, that people should go and find people who are making, inappropriate comments and turn them in. I suspect we're going to see much more of that kind of thing. So, uh, yeah, complaining, turning someone into HR because they made a comment that you didn't agree with is not the same thing as turning someone into HR for making a derogatory comment about you or a coworker, or making or discriminating against you or complaining on behalf of a coworker. So, it's probably important that people recognize that distinction before making those comments, which kind of goes to another point we talked about, which is, man, there's been such a flurry of people just throwing things out online. And I'm seeing now today, which we'll get into momentarily, people with platforms, like legitimate sized platforms, making comments about something that broke and then having to backtrack and make, well, I was wrong because more information came out. It's like people really have not, they just aren't able to just pump the brakes and see how the facts shake out before they make, these observations online for everyone to see. All right, well, so we have the private employees, then we have public employees or public employers, public universities, schools, etc. Now, the standard there is different. There is some measure of protection for the things that you say. So, how would you distinguish that from the private employees, private sector?
Yeah, so public employees have some First Amendment protection when they're speaking as a private citizen on a matter of public concern. That's the test. So you're not speaking, it's not like you went out there and spoke on behalf of your employer and disgraced them in some way. You're speaking as a private citizen on a matter of public concern. You have some First Amendment protection for that. There is a little bit of a balancing test about the employer's interest and the disruption of their business. We do see that, like, for example, there are cases on the books where if your employee participates in a hate rally, like a Klan rally or something, that's not protected by the First Amendment, at least not in the private, or excuse me, in the employment context. So this, like, the First Amendment stuff can get a little convoluted because hate speech, and we're seeing that a lot now, people saying hate speech is protected. Ironically, up until last week, it was people that were a little bit more on the right politically who were very protective of free speech and very protective of the fact that even hate speech is protected by the First Amendment. That has kind of like flipped in this moment in time. But that being said, it is accurate that hate speech is protected from the First Amendment in the sense that the government's not going to throw you in jail for having, a Confederate flag or something like that. But in the public employment context, your hate speech may not be protected if it interferes with the operation of your public employer's business operations. So that's a kind of a caveat to that. I would say it seems like a lot of school districts are getting called on to fire people, fire teachers. I think this is dangerous. Not only do they have First Amendment protection, most teachers are protected by state civil service laws. They're protected by collective bargaining agreements. Just like we cautioned employees, don't rush, don't you, sometimes it's okay to wait before you speak. Employers also need to wait before they fire people. They need to wait to make sure that they're applying their policies evenly. They need to wait to make sure that somebody doesn't have 17 levels of protection, and now they're going to have lawsuits against them. So I think that people got incredibly worked up about this. I get that there's high emotion sort of on every side of this, but you do need to sort of take a deep breath. And I think also, this is like, I'll get on my high horse a little bit. As people who represent people in employment cases, and we have clients on all parts of the political spectrum, losing your job is like, other than the loss of a family member or something like that, or a really serious health problem, losing your job is usually the most traumatic thing that happens to people in their life, and being unemployed. I cannot overstate the downward spiral that people can go into when they lose their job. I think people dehumanize other people on the internet and have no perception of the fact that there's a human being who's supporting their family on the other side of it, even if they said something that you find to be incredibly offensive. So I wish that people would sort of take a deep breath before they report people to their employers and things like that. I mean, we have clients whose coworkers or boss did like disgusting things to them, and they still don't want them to lose their jobs because they or their pensions, because they have some empathy for, you did something bad, I'm going to have my recourse in this way, but I don't want you to lose your livelihood. And that's something that I think kind of like gets lost in this. People are delighting in people losing their jobs, and I don't think it's a good thing to have a million unemployed people, for this type of thing. And again, 2 weeks ago, it was the sort of other side of like the woke cancel culture that was responsible for doing that type of thing. And I think, you and I are on the record of not really agreeing, with that kind of thing either.
Yeah. We, look, this issue of outrageous speech has been a problem in the US for a long time and has been the subject of significant litigation. Um, I mean, you think about Alex Jones, and the comments he made post Sandy Hook, and there were remedies in that situation to some degree in the private world, the private legal system, but the government was not coming after or encouraging anyone to come after Alex Jones. And you think back to like the Westboro Baptist Church, which made headlines 10 or 15 years ago, relating to a funeral that they went and protested at for a Marine who was killed, uh, Matthew Snyder, and, brought signs that said, "Thank God for dead soldiers." And the Supreme Court held, 8-1, said that, that speech is protected. It's not the basis for, liability in tort claims. And so this has been the subject of a lot of, heated conversation over the years, but it has always come back to this type of speech is protected, whether you agree with it or not. And I don't agree with people saying online that anyone deserves to be killed. I think it's horribly insensitive, but it's messy in the employment world, and it can definitely get people into trouble, whether it's ultimately protected by the First Amendment or not. Which leads us into the big news story today. So we're recording this on Thursday. On Wednesday night, ABC announced that it was pulling Jimmy Kimmel's late night television show off the air, uh, as a result of some comments that Kimmel made following Charlie Kirk's assassination. Not specifically relating to Charlie Kirk, but he made a comment to the effect of MAGA not being able to admit that the shooter was one of them. Now, ultimately, that probably is not true, but that's sort of beside the point. So the initial response that I started to see from people online with big platforms was, hey, you work for a private company, Jimmy Kimmel. ABC's well, it's a publicly traded company, but it's not the government, and they can do whatever they want, and they can fire you because you said something stupid. That is true. Happens often, has happened, different times in the past, and if that were where it stopped, then that would probably be a reasonable argument. Um, Subsequently, we've begun to learn that there appears to have been pressure from the FCC placed on ABC and threats made to potentially pull their license or provide further investigate the organization, which potentially led to ABC making the decision. That is a very slippery slippery slope from a First Amendment perspective. And frankly, whether you agree with Jimmy Kimmel or not, that's to me this is not a good thing. And I'll let you talk about the case that applies here, but I will comment that one of the biggest cases that we'll talk about, which probably says that this type of thing is not okay, relates to the a Democratic governor of New York trying to do something similar. So this is not to suggest that this is the first time this has ever happened. This is not to suggest that the administration is doing something completely unprecedented, which in my mind is actually somewhat reassuring that this has happened before and it's been sort of handled or dealt with. But why don't you explain what the argument is as to why this is potentially a problem.
Yeah, so even though he is a private employee, and I think the knee-jerk reaction of a lot of people who, were okay with him being let go was exactly what we've sort of been saying, which is that private employees don't have free speech in the workplace. That changes when you bring in the element of potential government coercion. So there's a recent Supreme Court case from 2024, where this was sort of one of those, the ACLU is keeping themselves honest cases. The ACLU represented the NRA in a case against Governor Cuomo and another government official in New York. Actually, she is the named party in the case. Why can I not find it right now? Vulo. So basically, in a nutshell, it's like a little bit convoluted, but the NRA accused the governor's office of interfering with their sort of private business dealings with insurance companies and banks within the state of New York. So those were private businesses. Typically you would say, like we said, no First Amendment rights when it comes to private businesses. You can't sue a private business for violating your First Amendment rights. But there is Supreme Court precedent that when the government coerces a private entity to retaliate or censor another entity in order to squash their speech, that is a violation of the First Amendment. You don't sue the private company for that, you sue the government officials for that. So in the Jimmy Kimmel context, he probably has a contract. I don't know what his contract says. I'm sure if he decides to sue anybody, I'm sure his employer will be included in there. But who would you sue in this situation? The chair of the FCC, maybe. We'll see how it shakes out. We don't know. There's certainly people online who, if you bring up this FCC issue, just immediately say fake news. I think he is like literally on the record, his face recorded saying some of this. But ultimately, even if he said it, there is, of course, a very sort of laid out legal test for when you are going to fall within that category of protected situations. And that's all laid out in this very recent Supreme Court case. So, this is a situation where that could cross the line. What I think it's actually probably even more relevant to, because it's very directly on point to the NRA case. So the ACLU got a lot of pushback when they took that case, but they took it because the NRA is an advocacy organization, whether you agree with what they're advocating for or not. And the case is going to be applicable to advocacy organizations in general, many of which are on all parts of the political spectrum. And what I think is interesting is that we have had a lot of rhetoric from the administration that using the shooting of Charlie Kirk sort of as the impetus for it to go after what they call left-leaning organizations. Stephen Miller considers the entire Democratic Party to be a terrorist organization. This case, ironically, a case that the NRA won against Governor Cuomo, who until all this mayor stuff was like a hated figure by the right, is potentially going to be the case that prevents them from being able to do what they're trying to do when they insinuate that they are going to squash left-leaning organizations. I don't know what they mean by that. I don't know what they're intending to do, but this is when we have like real, actual free speech issues.
Yeah, and it'll be interesting to see how this all plays out. There's a scenario where if the government hadn't gotten involved here, ABC might have gotten a lot of pushback, and maybe they capitulate to the critics, and this happens anyway. And in that case, there is probably no First Amendment issue. But
Right. And
uh,
they're saying, and again, we don't know. When you have a lawsuit, the nice thing about a lawsuit is these things shake out in discovery. People are saying that internally, people at ABC and Disney did not actually have a problem with what he said. I do feel like I have to say a little something in defense of Jimmy Kimmel. He was one of the people who came out right away when Charlie Kirk was shot and gave his condolences and said, this is horrible. Political violence is horrible. I listened to what he said in his monologue. I read the transcript of it. He is making fun of the reaction to the identity of the shooter, and he is joking around about the president not, when he was asked, Mr. President, we give you our condolences on your good friend, immediately started talking about the ballroom that they're building in the background.
yep.
Every satirical, website and show in the world kind of made fun of that a little bit. He did not dance on Charlie Kirk's grave, and he did not say anything about his death itself. It was the reaction to the shooter and trying to, we're all kind of, people are doing like these mental gymnastics of like, what box are we going to put this guy in? I put him in the box of angry, armed young man who perpetrate most of these shootings, left or right or whatever. He was one person. And I think that's sort of what he was speaking about. And I think one of the dangers that we're having right now, and with people being fired and things like that, is that we've kind of created a category of people deserve to be fired and suffer the most severe consequences of their words if they have to do with celebrating this person's death. But their definition of celebrating this person's death has become so broad that it includes any discussion of his legacy. It includes any discussion of anything that he said, ironically, when his platform was debate me, tell me why I'm wrong, and even putting his own words in quotation marks. When you have that level of that doesn't make sense, you're kind of inviting, a backlash. And to me, sadly, that does not really do much to honor that person's memory or legacy, really. So, and my last thing, because I saw this come up a lot, was people were saying, well, Jimmy Kimmel celebrated when Tucker Carlson was fired. And I'm only bringing this up because we actually talked about Tucker Carlson getting fired when it happened, because I think he got fired at the same time as Don Lemon. And Tucker Carlson was not fired because he said some, off-color joke that, the woke mob canceled him for. He was fired because his text messages about the 2020 election being stolen or not were used in a defamation lawsuit against Fox News, in which they had to pay millions and millions of dollars and admit that they didn't actually believe that the 2020 election was stolen. And the timing of it indicated that he likely was a scapegoat in that situation. So I just think it's fair to put that, in context.
Yeah, there's a lot of sort of bitter irony here. I didn't agree with much of what Charlie Kirk said, but one of his major platforms was there's no, free speech is free speech, and you should be able to say whatever you want and debate it. And if someone says something, in poor taste, you should call them out for it, and that should be a debate, a discussion. And shutting that all down, look there, and I would say there's a fine line, but I think we've crossed it. So, this is going to be an interesting test of how well the system holds in the current environment. So, we'll be interested to see how this plays out and how it shakes out over the next couple of weeks. I think we'll probably continue talking about this because it's an interesting legal conversation, and it's also something that's, in the forefront of most people's minds.
Yeah, I mean, if you're interested in, the First Amendment, especially in an employment context, it's certainly interesting. I mean, the case that, the NRA case is interesting to read. It was unanimous, by the way.
Yeah.
Um, or maybe there was one dissenter, but
Well, the Westboro case was 8-1. I mean, these
yeah,
cases,
I mean, a
this is
lot of
well
these
settled
courts,
law. Yeah.
right. Well, that's what I was going to say. The interesting thing, and actually, I think literally up until last week, a lot of defenders of the First Amendment would have been on the same page about this, which is that the cases are often unanimous because when you can look at things dispassionately, you understand that you have to apply these standards evenly amongst everyone, whether you like their speech or not. I mean, the inciting violence First Amendment case was another case that the ACLU, where a Jewish attorney from the ACLU represented a white Ku Klux Klan member. So, that's what's sort of kind of strange, I think, as a more like legal person, like observer of this situation, because, you know, this man who has not even been laid to rest yet, who was lauded as a champion of free speech, is being used to people's own political ends to actually damage actual real free speech.
Yep. Yep. Well, let's I think we're running late, so I think we should leave it there. We will revisit this again next week. And there's a couple other stories we wanted to get to, but we are running late on time, so I think we'll come back to them next week. Um, Anything else before we wrap for today?
No, I think that's it.
Okay.
I'm available to represent you, Jimmy Kimmel.
There you go. If he's looking for
I
if he's
read the
looking for
case.
someone.
I'm ready.
All right. All right. Well, thanks for listening. If you like the podcast, please like, subscribe, and share. If you have questions, hit us up on Instagram at Litigious Podcast, and we will be back again next week with more legal discussions of stories in the news. Thanks again for listening.